uncertainty is the new normal, and I want to discuss this with the following panelists. First with us is Roland Harings, CEO of Aurubis, the leading European copper manufacturer, which is a key element to renewable energy, so it will be becoming more important in the future. Also with us is Werner Baumann, CEO of Bayer. Welcome. The multinational pharmaceutical and life sciences company. Suzanne is with us, the president and CEO of the US Chamber of Commerce, the nation's largest business lobby. Great to have you with us, Ms. Clark. And of course, Mr. Amadou Hott joined us, the Minister of Economy, Planning and International Cooperation of Senegal. Good to have you with us. So, Ms. Clark, to set the ground, so to speak. What are you tracking right now concerning resilience or lack thereof, especially in the American market?
Well, thank you for that question. I think we were talking a little bit in the green room about the fact that it's important we're having these conversations, but also that we might start on a slightly more optimistic note, which is there was a lot about the supply chains in the last 2 years that proved to be pretty resilient. And if you start from raw materials and ideas all the way through PPE and vaccines and getting them distributed, perhaps not as well as we would have liked, but still much more than we would have thought possible in just 2 years. And so some pieces of the supply chain certainly were working. In the United States, what we worry about the most vis-a-vis the supply chain is probably two things. One, making sure that we're diversifying, having more than one customer, having more than one supplier. But also we have a big worker shortage. And so part of what the consumer feels as a problem in the supply chain is frequently a lack of truck drivers, people working at the ports. And so figuring out how the bottlenecks we can control, we work to control, is something we're very focused on.
Okay, so Mr. Baumann, would you agree? Did you manage quite well? Were you already resilient during the pandemic concerning supply and value chains?
Well, I guess resiliency is always a question of the current state of affairs, and the challenges that we are facing. And looking at the last 2.5, 3 years, I think 4 years ago, nobody would have thought that we would see such a massive sequence of crises, because not just one. It's not only the pandemic, which is far from over, but we also have a massive second crisis now, which has been triggered by the Ukraine-Russia war. And looking at our company, for example, I can say that we, of course, see areas where we have Achilles heels that were not that visible before, depending on our manufacturing footprint, but also look at the resiliency of our supplier networks, where a lot of the stress that we saw was not driven by an inability to supply, but was more about an inability to get products across borders when the pandemic hit, because a lot of governments closed borders, and with that provided an additional signal of stress into the supply chain, which then of course led to companies going for extra purchases in order to stock up, in order to make sure that they could continue to supply, which then has further exacerbated this crisis.
So, Mr. Harings?
Yeah, if I may.
Yeah, what just to spin the question a little bit. What turned out to be your superpower in securing supplies, and what was your Achilles heel, as Mr. Baumann said?
It was, I think, this crisis, and I'm absolutely with my colleague here, there is crisis after crisis. But what we have seen is that our business model has been confirmed by this crisis. And if I just reduce this to the 3 main points, what we have done in the past and what are doing since many years, it's diversification of supply chains. So to give you a bit of background, Aurubis, we are purchasing about 2.5 million tons of copper concentrate from more than 35 different mines around the world. So when we saw in the pandemic, like you said, that harbors were closed or, let's say, shipments were difficult, we always were able, with a lot of effort, I have to admit, but we were always able to find an alternative source for supply, and we kept our plants completely running. The second point is recycling. We have, since many years, increased the recycling quota in our company, and today we are recycling 1 million tons of different complex metal-containing materials in our, as we call this, smelter network. So also here, when something was not possible, like again, borders closed or Spain down in pandemic, we had alternatives because we had this network, we have long-term relationship with our suppliers. So this also helped us, again, to keep everything sourced and supported. And the third thing, what we have also done since many years, to decarbonize. So the dependency from fuel energy has been also reduced for special coal qualities or special fuel qualities which were typically used in the copper or the metal processing industry, has been reduced. And today we produce with about half the CO2 footprint, which comes with the electrification we have done, our materials. So if I take these 3 points, they made us, I think, very strong and brought the resilience that we, in pandemic, in crisis and everything, also here Russia, again, we immediately stopped supply from Russia, which were limited, and we had alternatives. So therefore, I think this diversification and all these elements is something that the business is in charge of. What we need is the support from the politics that we can really build this diversification. And that's something that we have seen in the past as being, I would say, limited support, because we tend to get a lot of restrictions in supply chain statements, in, let's say, which countries we should deal with or not. So here, if there would be one thing I would ask, or we should work on, that there is more understanding on the political side, how business can be supported so that this diversification, as broad as possible, can be done.
Diversification.
Please.
Get a little abroad. No, an even bigger one now. Okay. I'd like to stand on that point, or I'd like to stay there for a second. Diversification could also be translated in making new friendships. And there I'm directing the question to you, Minister Hott. Chancellor Scholz just went to Senegal to visit you, and you described the outcome of this as a possible win-win partnership. Do you care to elaborate?
Yes, definitely. As I mentioned earlier, Africa can provide alternatives to G7 countries in terms of not only procurement of certain raw materials, including gas, but also as potential future markets, which will help, let's say, companies in Europe, for example, have different customers and not rely only on few partners and be definitely at risk. Germany and Senegal, we are working together. We'll see how far we will go in terms of being able to provide gas to Germany in the near term. Discussions are ongoing. We have some energy companies developing these gas fields in Senegal. They have already some customers. But who knows, Germany could be one of them. But what's important for us is to accelerate some of the gas development that we were thinking of starting in 27, for example, to start them now with the help of, let's say, strong off-takers like companies or governments in Europe that will help us raise the funding that is needed to develop that gas and ship it over here through the LNG that we are developing as well.
I'd like to broaden the view now. You already talked about diversification as a possible tactic to tackle resilience, but there's also a lot of voices to be heard that say we should store more or reshore. How is your view on that, Mr. Baumann?
I think that is, in a number of areas, certainly meaningful. Yeah, when it comes to strengthening companies in the situations of crisis, but I don't think that nearshoring or this idea of verticalization of supply chains is a really good idea. All of us have benefited for the last decades from a really diversified, global, multilateral, and open world. And it would be very short-sighted to put this into play. Because if you really think it through to the last consequence, verticalization in order to produce a product means having everything under control. Politically, it's a great idea, but I think economically, and also, by the way, politically, this is very, very dangerous. First of all, we do have an existing installed base of capital and resource that does the trick today. I think the world has more challenges than funding available. If I look at global warming, the climate crisis that we are facing, the fact that Ukraine at one point in time has to be rebuilt. We have an aging population. We have many other priorities. And then going into heavily redundant investments of capital stock doesn't sound like a great idea to me. Secondly, nearshoring, or let's say nationalization, also means that some of the value add that creates jobs and prosperity in a number of other countries will actually fall victim of such a policy. So from my perspective, I would actually argue heavily against it.
Mm-hmm. Okay. What's your view on that, Ms. Clark? Do we experience a shift now from just in time to just in case, or does it come at a too high price?
One of the fears we always have about government is they're regulating to the last crisis, instead of looking forward to a new economy, to new situations. I agree with my colleague that we have so much we're confronting at one time. And so I think the role of government is to not do any harm, and to really take a step back and a deep breath. I think companies are rethinking what has to be made at home, what could be more effective closer to home, but cannot rethink an entire supply chain. It would create new bottlenecks and new problems and wrong redundancies and a bad use of capital. And so I think where we sit at the US Chamber, it's really about thinking there are things for our defense industry and others that have to be made at home. There are other things that might be closer to home, but we'll always have a global supply chain. I mean, we're not going back, and we shouldn't go back.
This might also lead countries to withdraw from other markets, this reshoring, Minister Hott. What's your view on that? I mean, this also means that there might be jobs lost and opportunities lost in other countries.
Yeah, it could be the case maybe in Asia. I don't expect it to be really the case with Africa because, I don't see any issues really exporting goods or services or raw material or semi-finished products to Europe today. So the risk is not really Africa. You have to look at it from somewhere else. Actually, to the contrary, we're expecting maybe more industries, more manufacturing to come into Africa because, we have the same time zone. We are very close to each other. Shipping things to Europe takes only 5-6 days, for example, from Dakar. And we're building the infrastructure as well in Senegal, for example, and in several African countries so that we can welcome those new investments, whether it's special economic zones or industrial parks or strengthening the regulatory environment or even government providing incentives for companies to locate or relocate to Africa, in particular Senegal, is something real. One thing is that we shouldn't just look at Africa also as one country. It's 54 countries, different competitive advantages. So each country has its own competitive advantage, and I think the B7 countries can use that to see where they can locate some of the manufacturing capabilities that they have somewhere else. That might be more cost efficient to bring it to Africa than even to bring it to Europe.
Mr. Harings, you already called out the politics. What actions do they need to take, do governments and leaders need to take in order to form a more resilient economy?
I can give one very good example what happened and how complicated it sometimes is. We were as a company in very intensive discussion with a mine developer, developing a mine in Panama. You know that copper concentrates or mining activities are quite often in let's say, more distant, different countries. A perfect mine, all sustainability criteria. It was really a top-notch developer. We wanted to enter into a very long-term agreement combined with the financing. The problem was this mine had energy production, electricity production with a coal-fired power plant. And this didn't meet our extreme standards that we apply here in Germany. And in the end, we couldn't make the project because we couldn't really support this financing. And that's for me such a typical example that we should enter in these projects. As I always say, stay and improve. There was the willingness on the mining operator side to think about how can we build renewable energy in the future. But we were not able to convince the stakeholders, the political, also the banking sector, to accept that this transformation way will take some time. Let's get started, and then we invest jointly and continue with our clear set of values, code of conduct, which was already mentioned today, to even improve this project further. And that's something which I would also, in the whole discussion about the supply chain legislation which is coming, rather stay and improve. A certain minimum criteria have to be met. I don't argue about this. But let's enter into projects and then with our positive aspects, with our support, develop them further, then just always have the highest expectations and then walk away, because the risk is somebody else is going to do these projects and we are not diversifying and we don't have then the source of supply, in this case of raw materials.
Looking for another good example here, looking at you, Mr. Baumann. You formed a partnership with Planet Labs, actually. That is with Planet Labs. Bayer formed a partnership with Planet Labs?
That's news to me, but maybe.
So satellite data and everything, also, as I read, to improve your supply chain resilience. You don't know anything about that? But how can actually this...
Maybe I should, but that we have a partnership with Planet Labs?
Planet Labs.
Planet Labs.
Leading provider of SkySat imagery.
First time I hear about it, yeah. But if you say it, must be true, yeah. So, but I can maybe I can latch on to Mr. Harings. I can only second what was said. What we see is not necessarily always pro-business and pro-common sense. In particular, in continental Europe, we have that situation that a lot of the regulatory activity is driven by an overly cautious approach, which is actually risk avoidance rather than opportunity oriented, which means that for many of us, it's actually very, very difficult. And ecosystems with great ideas can only flourish if an idea is nurtured and then helped along to, let's say, full success. And if I look at our company, and you made that example as well, the situation in Europe is not such that that would be the case. One of my colleagues has started to talk about Europe as the Silicon Valley of regulation, which is not necessarily a compliment, because if that's our main competitive advantage, I have no hope for Europe.
Okay, Ms. Clark, you were nodding a lot right now. Quick thoughts on what was shared, please.
Well, I was going to add to it, to what both of the gentlemen said. What we see a lot in the United States, and I think in some of the other B7 countries, is when every election is a swing election, then companies don't have in the United States more than a 2 to 4 year window to think about capital investment. And so when every administration is going to have a completely different regulatory approach to energy infrastructure or to pharmaceutical regulations or to food regulations, it becomes very hard for capital, as we were talking about earlier, Minister, capital is going to go where it's wanted and where it's safe and where it's stable. And so we've got to decide that we're making progress, and the progress is the important part, but to have some kind of sure landscape where companies feel they can make a longer-term capital investment than worry that every 2 years, the United States in particular, will have a completely different regulatory scheme.
So resilience comes at a cost. We already heard it requires technology, like from Planet Labs, maybe, Mr. Baumann. And in the future, it will also have lots more to do with sustainability. You already addressed the Supply Chains Act that's coming up in the EU, the one that is currently underway in Germany. Do you think, Mr. Harings, that puts an additional strain on an already struggling economy?
I don't think so. I think it's a continuation what most or all the companies I know are already doing since long. We are doing, for example, a business partner screening since many years. We really look with whom are we business. Is this a company which applies the same values, the same rules? Is this a decent business partner with whom we can work for long term? I'm more concerned about, again, the regulation which comes on top of this. If you see one example like taxonomy, what is being developed in Brussels now, I have to say it's quite shocking what kind of administrative burden, and also I have to say, we are here between us, this is done in a very, I would say, not in a very good way how it is formulated. I see the teams, and I hear this from other companies too, they are really struggling because it's ambiguous, it's not clear, it's far too detailed. And these kind of regulations, these things in the sustainability context, these are more my concern than what we as a company continue to do and perhaps even accelerate towards the future. So here a bit more trust and support again from the politicians into the industry. We don't need to be convinced about sustainability or about decarbonization. The only thing is we need to find the right transformation path so that we can meet all the needs of the stakeholders, also our investors. So we cannot do everything overnight, and that's what I don't see so much in the regulation that is coming from, especially from Brussels these days.
Coming back to the Supply Chains Act, what are your views on that, Mr. Baumann? I mean, you have to monitor every single station along the supply chain concerning human rights and sustainability. Isn't this really stressful and a lot of work that you can't do without?
Well, you know, it's part of doing business. How else can we make sure that we have proper control of adherence to, say, quality standards, that we have proper control relative to what you said earlier, the adherence to our basic principles that we apply to everything that relates to business, for example, when it comes to the avoidance of child labor. And if I look at that example in particular, we do go and audit because we have a number of business lines that are prone in our supply chain to child labor, and that is something that nobody at Bayer wants. So first of all, it's setting the right level of expectations, having the right policies out there, selecting the right suppliers, and then also monitoring compliance. Is a key part. So that's a closed loop process that you have to apply if you want to, let's say, guarantee a certain level of standard inside of the value chain. So we do it all the time across the board. Like many big companies, we have thousands of suppliers. We apply different standards. We have regular audits that we do ourselves with our strategic core supplier base, and then the supplier base that stands a higher risk of, let's say, sustainability issues. When it comes to climate or, let's say, labor conditions. Forced labor, for example, is another good topic. And these are the things that we do ourselves. And then we use, of course, also third-party help when it comes to the assessment of overall adherence in our broader supplier base. So we do that all the time. And when it comes to sustainability and, of course, developing a business is actually not an either-or. The way that we think about it is similar to what you do in Aurubis. Sustainability has become an integral part of our strategy and our business operations. So it is not an either-or, it is part of business. And I believe that developing sustainable solutions is the only way to stay relevant and in business for the next decades to come.
Mr. Hott, what would you say? Is it actually like sustainability might be even working in favor of resilience?
Yeah, I would say so, but each country has its special situation. If you look at Africa, for example, today, our priority really is to give access to electricity to the 650 million people who do not have access to electricity, meaning that kids are not going to school at night, are not studying at night, women and young people don't have economic opportunities, poverty remaining there. So that special situation, I think, needs to be taken into account before making rules and regulations, for example, that prevent financing, let's say, gas projects, let's say, in countries like ours. At the same time, also, pursuing decarbonization with new technologies such as the hydrogen green hydrogen can give us a lot of opportunities because we have the wind, we have the solar, so we have the water. If you have all of that, you can be a leader in that field if you have the right investments partnering our countries. But pending we get there, we must utilize the gas that we have in Africa to help fast-track Africa's development. And if Africa was to use all its gas today, all its gas, which is impossible, then we'll add to global emissions only 0.5%. We'll go from 3% only to 3.5%. At the same time, transform our economies, our industries, create wealth, and create the savings that we need to reinvest massively in green hydrogen, in renewable energies, and so on and so forth. Because today, the industrialized world, let's not forget, has utilized all the resources available for the last 100 years, whether it's gas, oil, coal, to build wealth. And so it will be hard for us to say, don't use it, and there is no alternative. Africa is happy to decarbonize, to use other alternatives, if we are provided with those alternatives. To just keep that in mind in terms of global regulations. Mm.
Something you probably look at very closely at green hydrogen, which is not yet a reality, Mr. Harings.
But it's around the corner. It's around the corner. I think it can be done from a technical point of view, and I'm an engineer, so I'm very optimistic that we are getting all the building blocks together. There are still challenges on the supply chain, the right say vessels who can transport hydrogen, but I'm very confident that we have enough engineering and technology power to deliver these solutions. And but one thing is clear: as Germany or as a company which is energy intensive and will stay to be energy intensive, we need affordable, sustainable, and available energy 24/7. So that's what we have to take into account, and I think this solution is not clear yet how this will be designed specifically in a German or European context, because we need base load. We can do a lot with wind and solar, but this is limited. Let's say Senegal, you have much more sun than we, so there is probably more time in the year, but what we still have to see is what is the plan, the long-term plan. How will our energy system look like in Europe, in Germany in the future? And again, specifically, what is the baseload solution and how competitive will this baseload solution be? Because otherwise, if we don't answer this question positively, an industry like ours, which is, let's say, supplying material to world mark prices, we are a price taker in the metals, copper, zinc, tin, whatever we are doing, we will not be competitive. Then these supply chain, where we are today very, let's say, happy that we had them with the resilience, but if the energy mix and the price for energy is not long-term, the perspective to stay competitive, we will have a problem. And this industry and other industry have disappeared in Europe for this specific reason. So therefore, we need to be, again, there was the statement said, ehrlich machen. So we need to be honest with each other. What's the model going forward and what are the price tags for that?
Mr. Baumann, Mr. Baumann, you took your microphone when Mr. Harings was just talking. What would you like to add?
I always take it so I can add to what you said. So on energy, we are not that energy intense anymore. So our energy footprint is about 1% of our sales. Yeah, so relatively limited, but still without access to energy 24/7 and really reliable. The issue that comes with it is that we cannot really plan and execute our operations. And it goes even further that beyond our ability to mitigate, for example, that major issue in gas shortage that we might face in Europe, we will not be able, and in particular in Germany, we will not be able to mitigate it in our supply chain. And then we have these interdependencies where we actually get supplies from other partners in chemical parks as precursor for our products. So if they are allocated less than what we would need as their byproducts, our manufacturing and our products would stand. Yeah, so I can only second what you say. affordable, reliable energy supply is the lifeline of really every business around.
And if I just add one point, as a raw material producer, if you see where, let's stay for a second with the metal copper, and we want to build more renewable energy, which is always electric cars, everything is more copper intensive that we want to have for the future. So I think it's in our best interest that we strengthen this industry, that we have boundary conditions, that this industry can provide the starter stock for so many other industries and companies here in Europe.
Ms. Clark, I'd like to include you in our discussion now. You already were part of the B7 summit this morning and talked about climate clubs and decarbonization and underlined the importance of a level playing field in these regards. But when it comes to the EU Supply Chain Act, it's actually an uneven playing field that is created, isn't it?
You know, it's interesting because this is my first B7 in person since becoming CEO. It wasn't quite the same on Zoom last year, I have to say. And to broaden your question a little bit, I would just say this. While we have focused a lot at this meeting and at the B7 on the challenges that we all face, and we know what they are, and we know what a complex time this is, the state of the business associations is quite strong. And I think this idea that as alliances, as partners, as the private sector, there's a lot of innovation that we can unleash. There's a lot we can do to both solve these problems and innovate and capture and create opportunities and to become a more economically inclusive world. And I was encouraged at our meeting with the Chancellor today, at our meeting with all the B7 all day, that we might do this work together. And so that's real resiliency, not just beyond the supply chain. But it counts on a really strong, robust private sector. And so I think it's been quite a successful conference and an important message for us all to take away.
Can you elaborate a little bit on the communique you today took over to Chancellor Scholz?
Not in the 2 minutes and 42 seconds this clock says that we have.
Maybe concerning our topic right now, which is supply chains, value chains,
I feel
diversification.
It was really interesting to me, again, attending my first B7, how detailed the communique was, how robust the suggestions are and the recommendations are. And I think we've discussed here a number of the things that have to happen for government and private sector to work together to solve them. And I know this sounds really crazy because nobody wants to read. How many pages is it? 50? 45? Long? No one wants to read anything that long? It's worth it. It's worth looking at all of the details of the hard work that went into figuring out how together we can solve these big challenges.
Yes, please.
Yeah, for us in Africa, what's really important is that whenever regulations, rules are made globally and that will affect Africa, we would like to be at the table to give our perspective. That's why President Macky Sall is advocating, for example, for Africa to be part of the G20. Because if you put our GDP together, we are $2.6 trillion, the 8th largest in the world, and EU also is a member of G20. So the African Union can be a member of the G20, since most of the issues discussed there, would have to be implemented by Africa, whether it's climate change, debt, etc. It's Africa. So Africa being a member, not an invited guest. My president used to say that whenever a presidency takes over, they just choose to invite Africa or not. But if you're a member, then every year you are there, you can make your voice so that our special circumstances are taken into account.
Thank you so much, Mr. Minister Hott. I'd like to leave it at that. Ms. Clark has the time closely regarded, so you must know what I'm talking about. I fill you in about the Planet Labs thing right now, Mr. Baumann. We have some time in our hands right now. Thank you, Mr. Harings. Thank you, Mr. Baumann, Ms. Clark, and Minister Hott for a wonderful discussion. Good to have you.
Thank you very much.